fooled me once. Shame on you. It fooled me. We can't get fooled again.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to episode 4 of Reframing the Narrative, the Pandemic of Fear. We're really happy to have you back with us again this week. And we're also very pleased to be joined once again by TJ Bowman. We just had such a great conversation over the past couple of weeks. We wanted to continue on this idea of fear and where we put our attention. Welcome back, TJ.
Thanks for having me.
And as we just started there with that clip about there's nothing to fear but fear itself, it's a perfect lead into what we want to talk about today. And that's really, as the title suggests, the pandemic of fear, but also I look at it as fear as a weapon. And one thing that we were wanting to cover today, and of course, after this podcast, we'd love to hear what everyone else has encountered in their life and overcome through their own truth exploration. But, each of us have certain experiences in terms of things we used to fear and things that would control our lives in some way. And just through our own personal journeys of truth seeking have learned to overcome them and change some of our personal habits. I'll just start that. And you've heard me allude to this a little bit in some of our prior episodes, but there was actually a time in my life where I proudly proclaimed myself as a germaphobe, and I always had a bottle of hand sanitizer close by before I would eat. And it really wasn't until 2020 and things that really came to light in some of my awakenings in terms of germ theory or germ fraud, really, and understanding that there are no nasty viruses out there to kill you, that actually bacteria on your hands can be quite good for you. Your body lives in balance with many bacteria. And well, I won't go too far down the rabbit hole in terms of terrain versus germ theory. But all that being said, once my eyes were open to a lot of that and some of the fraud and early work by Pasteur and others, it really made me change how I viewed a lot of this. And now there's always common sense to be applied in making sure your hands are maybe rinsed off or not totally disgusting before you eat. But I'm not as afraid to just pick something up and eat it with my hands. And it sounds like something small, but it really isn't. When you look at what happened to the world in 2020 and you think about how people lost their minds and turned on each other, turned on family, friends, coworkers, etc. And to this day, there's many people, many workplaces that still require a little poke in the arm to be let through the front door. So it's a real effect of fear, and fear that's largely based on ignorance because most people don't bother to look behind the curtain. So I will say that, that's just one example of something that for me really changed how I behaved and looked at things. I can't remember if I mentioned this in our last podcast, but I used to say in 2020 to people who were worried about CV19, I would say, for me to make sure that I don't get that, I just turn the TV off. So that's my very long introduction and personal story. How about we kick it over to our guest, TJ Bowman?
Oh man, it's a virus of the mind. I think we all went through that pandemic of fear. Like we've all had an early on awakening. Let's say 9/11 was a good start. So 20 years in the game, and still when the pandemic started, I was absolutely terrified. Like it was like seeing all of these things that I had kind of passively feared coming to fruition. I was so uncertain if it was a real thing, if it was a fake thing, if it was a fake thing to usher in a real thing to like circumvent your trust. Or so in the first week of the pandemic, I developed shingles. I didn't know I had this in me, but it it manifested through stress. I got really ill at the onset of the pandemic, but not by any of the pandemic, just nerves, just shingles, which is chickenpox, but coming through your nervous system. And even if you're holding the fear of loss or some twisted version of fear in your body, you're holding that tension and you're leading yourself towards dis-ease. And I think going through all of that and seeing, like, I'm not seeing what they're saying. We can see where they're lying. There's a lot of things where it's hard to tell what the truth are, but the more, like, let's say the government threat of mandates turned into this thing where they just kept pulling the knife away right before they cut. So it was like the gesture of, oh, next week they're going to do it, and then the day before they're like, no, we're not going to do it. So it was like you start seeing that they don't have actual teeth behind the words. There's no bite behind the bark. And a lot of people complied implicitly on the onset because it was an impending deadline of something. And it was like, fear leads you to control. You can control people when you control their emotions. And when you control their emotions, you control their attention. It's that whole, your energy flows where your attention goes. And they want your energy. They're trying to focus our attention on what they can control. And it seems that it's mostly fear.
Well said, TJ. I couldn't agree more. And actually, I'll just take that a step further. That I remember during those crazy couple of years that it wasn't just fear being pumped through the mainstream media and getting people to react a certain way. It was also in the quote unquote alternative media where many of the voices we all found when we were looking for some different way of reframing the situation, many of those heroes, or I would say in air quotes, heroes of the truth movement, use fear for their own gain and to get people to act irrationally in a completely different way. I remember some of those folks constantly asking their audience, "What's your plan? What are you going to do?" Without
Do
actually
you have
offering.
gold and silver?
Yeah. Are you going to grow your own food? Do you have like enough food to feed everyone you know? Are you going to barter for cows? Like, just a lot of impractical advice that got people spun up and focused on things that, I mean, in their own respect, they can be useful. I mean, being prepared, there's nothing wrong with that, and it's advisable, especially as we talked about in a prior episode. We are in a particular golden age, if you will, thanks to number 47 and Alice Bailey and all the likes of them. So we have no idea what's coming ahead this year. But that being said, I remember back in those particular years where fear was really used as a weapon to get people spun up into a bunch of activities that ultimately really weren't necessary and really enriched a lot of those people and got them big platforms and a lot of followers and money for seminars and what have you. So this is all to say that the pandemic of fear was played by both sides.
Totally. I feel like the alternative side is more of a controlled opposition. And most of those big names that came out of nowhere to relative success, where you have all kinds of independent creators that get no traction anywhere, it kind of raises suspicion. And then, those same people use those platforms to sell products. And while I understand sponsorship is necessary in a lot of regards, it becomes a mechanism. Like if you're selling Patriot buckets or gold and silver or life straws or whatever the thing is you're drumming fear about. And it's like, that's just another charlatan snake in the grass.
Here, here. Yeah, and there were a lot of snake oil salesmen posing as good guys and heroes during that time. Now,
Are.
and still are.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, thank you for jumping in there, discerning Jake, because I think we need some discernment to kind of sort out who are these people and what's their agenda. But maybe before we get there, what's your story, DJ?
Well, I'll just add a little bit about what happens when you're still fearful. Maybe you're aware of one aspect of how you're getting scammed, but then you might be given one of these heroes and you fall into another trap in the so-called mainstream alternative media, and you start, let's say, stocking up on ivermectin or something like that. You might end up just going from one scam to maybe something that's not immediately as harmful, but could overall be just as harmful. We're not really sure in the particular case
Well,
of
it's like
ivermectin.
how many steps do you go from stocking up on ivermectin to drinking bleach? Like
Yeah.
that was out there. So, and I don't know what the story is with that. Maybe bleach is really, really just peak health food, and we don't know it because we're afraid of it. But that's definitely not medical advice, and don't drink bleach.
Yeah, don't do it.
So you stop trusting the authorities, the mainstream, and you start trusting a different authority of counterstream.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
you have to be discerning.
Yeah,
Well, thank you. That's my name.
And by the way, I hope you brought enough of discernment from earlier this week, Jake. That got me thirsty watching your 3.5 video. But no, absolutely, TJ, you bring up a really good point there, which is, be careful of anyone peddling medical advice of any kind that sounds a little fishy. I mean, I remember during that whole time that it was like chlorine dioxide and some other snake oil cures. Some people went as far as to start drinking their own pee, which to me was probably a humiliation ritual they didn't know they were participating in. And that might ruffle some feathers, and I won't go down that rabbit hole, but there are a lot of solutions proposed that really aren't good for you. So grab that big cup of discernment and let's move forward. Sorry, Jake, I know I stole some of your airtime.
Yeah, no worries. Well, I just wanted to give the example of how fear can make you stupid. It puts you on your heels, and it can make you do things, in the words of Frank Herbert, it's the mind killer. It turns your mind off. And I'll give the example of my own dad. May he rest in peace. He was the smartest person I've ever met, and a certified genius with like multiple patents and a career and all sorts of things that require brain power. And he wasn't even going out of the house pretty much. He was just hanging out. And he's aware of government tyranny. He's aware of scams. He knew that 9/11 didn't add up, to say the least. Yet he still had enough fear in him to go out and get 2 armed darts. And after each dose, he experienced vertigo for weeks on end, yet he still went out and got those arm darts. And so that's just an example of how a really smart person can do stupid things because of fear. He was fearful. Now, I do want to point out that good things can happen when we overcome fear. And in my personal life, my biggest fear in my entire life for my formative years was public speaking. The first time I had to give an oral report in 2nd grade or something like that, maybe even earlier than that, I wasn't even aware that I was fearful. But when I stood up in the front and I started speaking, I started shaking like a leaf. And then I noticed the kids in the front row were like, he's shaking. And then from that time on, it was a big issue. And I realized at one point that I needed to overcome this, because there's certain things I want to do in my life that require getting up in front of other people and speaking to them. And to our guest TJ's point about the power of fear to give you shingles, for instance, I was able, when I had an oral report scheduled, to give myself a fever, and I could go to the infirmary And I could say to the nurse, I don't feel well today. And she'd take my temperature and she'd send me home. Without fail, I was able to just give myself a psychosomatic fever. So
Oh
I think
man.
a big thing that we experienced, with the uptick in disease in 2020 and beyond was fear. So it literally was a mind virus that was circulating. Those are the real viruses, the ones circulating out there.
It's almost like the placebo effect. Like you create the cure within your body by your belief in it. You can create the disease in your body by your belief in it, or some kind of dis-ease. I don't know how exactly that would work, but I've seen a lot of, let's say, suggestion that disease comes from emotional trauma, and that there's psychological links to just about every ailment that we get.
Absolutely. German New Medicine is all about that. It's all about going into your traumas and the narrative that you're telling yourself, the stories you tell yourself. And German New Medicine and some others frame trauma as the story you tell yourself about your experiences. So I just thought I'd put that in there. I'm not a real practitioner of it, but I'm tangentially aware. And there's some good podcasts out there if you look for it.
And that really is the thing. It's reframing your narrative, your perspective. Like, the bad experiences can be good experiences, just changing your perspective on them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I was just going to say, too, when we think about narratives, and this could be its own separate discussion for another day, but I just want to throw out that not only do you have to be mindful of the external narratives that you're taking in, but you also have to be mindful of the ones that are coming from other places not seen or understood. And what I mean by that is my personal view of things is that we not only live in a 3D physical world, but we're also surrounded by a spiritual world where there's a lot of bad players. I'll just put it that way, dark forces that would influence you to think negatively or make bad decisions or harm yourself in some way, or to amplify that fear that we're talking about. So it's multi-pronged, really. It's not only discerning where you're spending your attention and what you're taking in, but it's also discerning those voices that are within you and determining, are those the voices I want to listen to and abide by? So it really is a multifaceted situation.
Yeah, and are those voices your own? Or is that somebody else's influence?
Exactly.
On the topic of bad players, I believe it was the CIA had a handbook on fear-based mind control. I read this a long time ago, and so I don't remember what the exact booklet was, but the gist of it, of what fear-based mind control was, and I guess this is like how it's used against us, and how it has the potential to be a weapon is, and like you said, DJ, it shuts off your brain. It's the mind killer. It is the fight or flight function in your brain that they're tapping into. They're utilizing what is known as the reptilian center of your brain at the base of your spine, or the base of your skull at your spine. The very core of the brain is that reptilian brain that controls fight or flight. And they put you into a state of fear in order to program you, because your brain goes into that fight or flight and has to subconsciously process all of the information that you're given in order to make the best quick response. So they bypass your rational thought by putting you into a place of fear and then feeding you information. That's the gist of the book. And knowing that can be liberating in the defense against the dark arts. Like, this is, I think awareness is the way you get around it. The news is just exactly that. They make you scared, and then they just feed you the things that they want you to believe.
Absolutely. That box in the corner doesn't broadcast anything that they didn't want you to see and absorb and process in some way. Or said differently, the camera always points where they want you to look.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, nice. Are you sure that box is always in the corner? It's usually pretty prominent in most people's homes.
Yeah, fair enough. It's front and
Unfortunately.
center in my living room. So yeah, point well taken. But
It's above the mantle.
yeah, the point I wanted to bring up too, though, is that to TJ's point, I mean, the CIA has been doing this for many, many decades and have it down to an art. And, you know, it comes through in media and entertainment and live events. And then you put the symbolism in there from our good friends, let's just say in the club for YouTube purposes, but all of that is intentional. And then there's the subliminal that most people won't pick up on, or as they call them, the profane masses will not perceive or understand that they're actually part of a ritual. And all of that has been perfected, even to the point where there's specific proof that they have ways. I mean, we knew about this, or it's been out there for a while. Like even in the Iraq War, they had this voice of God thing that they were broadcasting into the quote unquote enemy's minds to tell them that they needed to lay their weapons down and give up. And so this technology exists, and there's many ways that they can try to infiltrate our minds. And that's where, you know, discernment and also being close to God and having his protection can be your defense. But we're attacked from many sides, and kind of getting back to the point of this broadcast, fear is their biggest weapon to drive us in the direction they want us to go.
And it divides us too. Just think about 2020 and beyond when they put those silly circles on the ground and said you have to stay 6 feet apart. And some natural health practitioner friends of mine would say that's because our auras kind of intersect within 6 feet. They would have people fighting like, get away from me, you're not distancing, and that kind of thing. And then there were, you know, of course there was the mouth hole covers, the masks, and the people that I encountered on a hike in the middle of the woods who accused me of being a Fox News watcher because I was out breathing the air and they weren't. And they're like, put on your mask. And we said, why? We're outdoors. It's beautiful. And they're like, yeah, you should stop watching Fox News or something like that. I'm like, dude, I don't even watch TV. Stop watching CNN. But my point is that I shouldn't even gotten involved because it's like this guy was in fear, and I should have come around a lot sooner than I did to where I am now. And I'm not really trying to toot my own horn or say how elevated I am in consciousness or anything, but maybe I'm just a little thick and it took me a long time. But I did recognize the masks as an emblem of fear. And I also saw it as a placeholder for, you know, the experimental injections. But I didn't allow myself to feel sympathy or empathy for people that were showing the fear. And now I think I'm in a place where that's what I'm trying to get out of myself. In fact, I think it was 2 New Years ago, I made a resolution to be more compassionate and not to lash out at people like I used to roll the window down when I saw someone outside with a mask on. And I'm not a very confrontational person, but I'd be like, take the stupid mask off, you retard. And, you know, other insults like that. And, oh man, I didn't like that person that was yelling out the window. But now I'm just like, I say a little prayer. I'm just like, I would like to see this person and have this person released from their fear, because that's what divides us. We will do stupid things and mean things to each other when we're in fear.
Amen to that.
Amen.
It sounds like whether or not you're watching Fox News, you were weaponized against your neighbors for their reactions. It's kind of just the function of that governmental mechanism of propaganda through fear.
Yeah, and I think that DJ brought up a really good point too, and you touched on this as well, TJ. But you know, just the idea that this fear was used to divide us all into camps and to fight each other, because when we're fighting each other, we're less apt to fight the system and to resist and empower ourselves and create our own solutions, and that's where they didn't want us to be. So why
It's
not make
literally
it?
divide and conquer.
Yeah, exactly. So why not put us into the CNN and Fox camp and get people to hate each other over which side of the aisle they're on, when the reality is we should all be on the same side. And I just want to take this back, and I know I'm going off the rails here just a second, but it's something that I'm writing about now in a Substack I plan to release sometime soon. But kind of going back to what we talked about last week about where you put your attention is very relevant to this conversation, and thinking about how we're all kind of put in a situation where it's us against them, or me surviving on my own and by my own accord, and to hell with everyone else, like as long as I get mine. Like that's sort of the attitude that we've been given, because we're all chasing that piece of cheese on the hamster wheel, trying to get more money and get more material possessions or what have you. And I think about, let's just say, for example, I know that there are a number of people that I talk to who know that, I'm a firm believer in the millennial kingdom having come and gone. And just think about, and I'm just bringing this up for a specific point. Like, if we had no cheese or hamster wheel, and we weren't divided against each other, and there were no dark voices influencing us in our heads, and we had all the time in the world to create and to make beautiful things, how much different would our world be? And all of that is to say that, fear is such a driver of the things we do in our day-to-day life, even if we don't realize it or not, and we put our attention and focus on things that really don't matter, where we could be using our time so much more productively and to create beautiful things. We were given that aspect of being a human, that we're meant to create and do wonderful and beautiful things, and fear has no part in that. Now, that was a complete and total tangent. Bring us back home, TJ or DJ, but I just want to throw that thought out there.
Well, I'd like to go into how do we relate to fear and how do we deal with it? Because there's so much out there. And like you're saying, PJ, where do you focus your attention or pay your attention? And if you're focusing on fear, what does that do to you? So if you're conscious of harm that is being perpetrated on behalf of the evildoers, or the public serpents, as our friend Peggy likes to say, what do you do when you're aware of that? And I think that's kind of a theme in our podcast, is really like, we're not harping on this fear stuff and attaching to certain narratives that instill fear in people. So I think we should try and think of a few examples of how not to give into fear.
Yeah, great point, DJ, about, so what do we actually do to reframe that fear narrative and, change our lives accordingly? And TJ, you told me off air that you had a good story related to that. Why don't you take it away?
I like to think about these things as literally the Harry Potter defense against the dark arts class. Like, when you realize how much of these psychological programmings and nefarious actions going on have occult and magical implications, it really is, the defense against the dark arts. And so I guess we can discuss what some of those tools are, and I'll try to relate that in my story here. So years ago, I had a motorcycle that I had never had any problems with the law with. So I gave up all of the cares of the license plate, the insurance, the registration, everything was out. I just never updated it. And one day a motorcycle cop pulled me over. And this is like midway through my waking up journey to everything, but I had read a lot of the legalese behind the not the sovereign citizens movement, but the state nationals movement, which I also don't fully support, but I like a lot of the ideas and how you can question authority and how you have your consent engineered by those traffic stops, and they mostly operate on fear. You're being fearful of the outcome of, am I going to get tickets? Am I going to get arrested? Am I going to get beat up, thrown in jail? Like, what's the far end of this interaction? And, are you scared of it? But I had maybe a little bit too much confidence in what I had just read, but this cop was pissed about the state of my affairs, which hurt nobody. I had committed no crime. I was definitely my own liability, but I considered that my own personal responsibility. And so I ended up in this interaction with this cop where he's screaming at me on the side of the highway. And I was thinking about, how am I going to get out of this? Why would he think that I'm going to go along with this? Well, he's obviously mad and I should be afraid of him, but I had questioned the legitimacy of that authority a lot. So in that interaction, I was like, just to let you know, I'm recording you with my phone camera, which it was not. It was totally off. It was dead, actually, just in my pocket, though, and facing him. And so he calmed down, and I was like, I can't consent to any of this. You're enraged. You're threatening me. I feel that my safety is endangered by interacting with you. And so I can't consent to any of this. And he got real stern and squirrely with it and was just reiterating all of the laws and all the regulations and all of the things that I had done wrong in the system. And I was like, do what you have to do. Do what you have to do. But you have to know that and recognize that I don't agree with any of this. And when it came time to when he gave me the ticket to sign, I told him outright, I'm only signing this under duress, and signed under duress on the line. And he said, I'm going to make you drive your motorcycle to the nearest parking lot and leave it there and have somebody else pick you up and take you to work or whatever it was. And I was like, cool, whatever. And I went down the highway and I got off on the next exit and he didn't. And then I just got back on the highway, like, after he left. So I was like, all right. And so in the defense of the dark arts, the awareness is key. The idea of authority coming from somebody that you didn't give it to, it's weaponized. Our society functions on the, I guess, implied consent of this contract with the state, this exchange of rights for privileges to operate within the society. And it's all done in fraud. So it's like, how far do you want to give them the authority to tell you what to do? And now I can't say that isn't going to come without repercussions, but that's life. We live by the cause and effect of our inputs into the world. That's my interaction and response to recognizing when somebody's going out of their way to try and make me fearful. I really shouldn't be afraid of it. It kind of makes it look silly. So that's my experience. But what do you guys have?
Well, I just wanted to throw a couple of comments in there, and your story, I mean, so much of that resonates with me because it's almost back to the idea of where you're paying your attention, but in this case, it's how you're giving consent and which games you're agreeing to play, even if you don't realize you're agreeing to play them. And your story about, and your comment about, they only have the authority that we give them, reminded me a lot of that video by Larkin Rose that he made many years ago. So many people are afraid of the authorities, but when you plot out how many of us are versus them, it's actually quite comical. And Larkin Rose did a great job of illustrating that with blue and red dots. If our listeners haven't seen that before, it's pretty classic, some good Larkin Rose stuff. But you know,
Larkin is fantastic.
I think that Larkin's done some great work in kind of exposing where authority really lies. But I will say, I'll never forget, you do have to be careful with a lot of this and decide where your
Oh,
battle
yeah.
lines are. I remember back in 2021 when I had time to spend, actually quite a bit of time to spend with Ernie Hancock from Declare Your Independence. Now, this is when I was doing some volunteering for the Greater Reset, but he and I got to know each other pretty well. And I remember us talking about like the whole American national thing and like, you know, opting out of paying taxes and all that. And I'll never forget Ernie saying, you know, all that works until it doesn't. And he said, if you want a good story, just go ask Larkin Rose about that. So for those of you who aren't aware, Larkin did actually spend time in prison for tax evasion and definitely paid the price for his beliefs. So, you know, that was the hill he chose to die on. But it's just something, knowledge is power. And I think in your case, TJ, you know, you were able to show that the emperor had no clothes, but you do kind of have to be careful about some of this because we are surrounded by a pretty strong system with, you know, people who do have the full force of the law behind them.
And the contracts go deep, the structure of the society, and you're not going to get out of the contracts that you're literally signed into. Like if you've consented to taxation, you're in that. Like it is, if you don't go through the right channels to get out of it, you're in it, at least as far as I know, because it's all uncharted territory and you have questionable guides along the way as far as what you're supposed to be doing and where you're supposed to be going within that invisible framework. I think there's limits and extents to how much you can buck the authority, but in that instance with the motorcycle cop, that was over a decade ago, and I have never seen any further actions from that. So, and I definitely, let's say, got arrested for not having insurance on my car, a later incident, and that motorcycle one did not ever come up. It was actually my girlfriend's car that I had. It was too much of a thing for me to risk imposing questionable beliefs on, and so I went along with it. But you know, and that was, I guess, in the perspective of fear, my fear of losing my girlfriend's car to my antics made me doubt my confidence in that whole structure.
Well, at that point, it was common sense, right? It's like,
Yeah.
it's not your car.
Yeah. It exactly. So yeah.
You know, TJ, back to your point, I think it was in our first podcast together, you said that you are in this world and not of this world. But hey, the reality is we're still all in this world. So,
Yeah.
you know, I think to DJ's point, you still have to use common sense in a lot of this.
Yeah. And it's one thing to affect your own life, but then to, like you said, it's not my car, like to affect somebody else's life with my actions. Different game altogether.
And I think that just to answer your point, TJ, about maybe an anecdote of where I overcame my fear and kind of stood my ground, I can give the personal example of in 21 when I had a job that asked me to not only come into the office again, but to get some arm darts. And I said, no. I said, you know, I don't believe in it. I have religious reasons to not do that, and I stood my ground, and it was scary. I'll admit. I mean, you know, speaking of being in this world that we're in, you know, the threat of losing a job and what to do next was daunting, but ultimately, it all worked its way out. But you know, taking that stand is and putting that foot forward and you know, saying I'm not going along with this narrative and this scheme. You know, it takes some courage. And I think it's just, you know, it's a mix of both discernment and seeing the bigger picture and deciding where your battles are. And for me, it was really important to say no. And we all have that power. DJ, I don't know if you had anything else to add to that.
Yeah, for sure. One thing I kind of wanted to counter what TJ was saying a little bit, in that they talk about critical mass, a certain percent in the population can foment a revolution. And I don't think revolutions work, but just using that old aphorism, I think if enough people just said no to any number of things, including taxation or registering cars or anything like that, then they really don't hold any sway. And it's the same thing. Like if nobody ever social distanced and if everybody told their employer, no, I have an exemption, the exemption is because I don't wanna, then there wouldn't have been a scamdemic and there would never have been one. But I just think to add one more point, really, what do we do when we're facing something it could be a formidable foe. It could be something very genuine that's threatening us. And me being a baseball fan, I'm a one sport guy. What happens when you have Nolan Ryan on the mound? You know the guy's got a wicked fastball. Do you fear it or do you anticipate it? And I think the people who are best able to handle fear are the ones that acknowledge it, and instead of running from it, they anticipate it. So Nolan Ryan's fastball is coming. All right, I'm going to guess low and outside or something like that. I'm getting ready for it. When it's a bitter cold winter day and the wind is blowing, you put on a windbreaker with a down jacket. You prepare for it. So what do? Maybe sometimes it's an oblique kind of confrontation, but you prepare, you anticipate. And I think that can get you halfway back to getting your sanity and your intelligence back. Since we did reference Frank Herbert's quote from Dune saying, fear is the mind killer.
How do you re-engage your brain?
Yeah. I think that's going to be really key. And again, we don't really know what's in the cookbook for this year and beyond. We definitely see some road signs along the way and things that have been written over decades and decades. But I think knowledge of some of these schemes leading to something that could ultimately result in good when it's over. And that, again, I'm not going to belabor the whole little season thing. We talked about that last week, but I think that in the short term, it'll get worse before it gets better, but there's an ultimate better on the other side of that. And no matter what kind of craziness we might see, I have the peace of mind that there is a plan, that we will all be at that white throne together, and hopefully everyone made the right decisions to have a much better existence after that. So I don't fear any of this. I think it's going to be an interesting show to watch. But again, how much of that we choose to participate in versus just observe passively is the open question.
Well, brother, you just said it really well. Faith is a great weapon against fear.
100%.
That's like the gun in the holster of the magical tool belt there. If you're aware of the things that you're afraid of, you may just be aware that you're afraid. But if you believe and you trust in some higher order and higher power, that means you're going to be taken care of. In your mind, you're already taken care of.
And I think I made the point last week is the ultimate fear is the fear of death. And so far, no one's figured out how to get around that. Even the people who seem to be all about becoming gods themselves. And maybe they're inspired by fear of death ultimately, and that's their biggest driver. And it's a fool's game. So if we just look at them and think, you're fools. You may have a lot of weapons in your toolbox, but you can't win over me. And I don't know if I can take the position that I don't fear death, but it's a good thing to work on. Confront the fact that we're mortal and make the most of your time.
Yeah, to steal your quote from earlier this week, DJ, pay attention to what you're paying attention to.
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
Well, this seems like a natural conclusion to this week's broadcast, but I think I'd like to give our guests for 3 weeks running now, TJ, to maybe give some final thoughts, and then DJ, if you had any, and then we'll just invite everyone to join us again next week for the next episode of Reframing the Narrative.
First of all, thank you guys for having me. It's been great doing this. I love it. And I'm excited to see the other voices you can bring to the stage and the conversations that you'll have. I really enjoy your stuff here. But back to the concept of fear and the defense against the dark arts, the methodology and mentality that I have developed around it is that you have to go through it. And so you do like the buffalo and you head into the storm because you pass through it faster. And that's one weapon, but faith is an immunizer against fear. If you know that you're taken care of by your creator, the only authority over you is your own author, then you can have true confidence in your righteousness. If you know you're lined out right, if you're right with your God, with God, it's the ultimate weapon.
Well said on all accounts, TJ. And we've enjoyed having you on immensely. You will definitely be a regular guest of ours. So yeah, enjoy these conversations. Jake, any final thoughts?
I wanted to encourage some audience participation. We really want to engage with our audience, and we would love to expand the dialogue beyond what we're doing right here. So we'd love to hear from you. We do notice that we're getting a little higher numbers, which is great because it's really hard to market these things. So hopefully we're reaching a few people. And personally, that's what I'm all about. That's kind of just what my mission in the days remaining in my life are, no matter how many there are. I want to touch people. I want to touch their consciousness and kind of elevate each other and uplift each other and create beautiful things as long as we're capable of doing so. And my mission and my appeal is just treat everybody else better. Treat those around you better. Be nicer. Say nice things to people. Just give people a compliment. And sometimes you might hesitate to think, oh, maybe I'm not saying the right thing, but saying something is so much more important than saying it the right way, because people can sense that you're trying and your message is true.
I couldn't agree more with that. And I'm going to steal a quote that I've heard on the radio recently. The world is full of nice people, and if you can't find one, be one. So I just wanted to kind of piggyback on your comments there, DJ. Absolutely. Let's elevate together. Let's work against these narratives and live better lives with the time that we do have left. And I wanted to mention to our listeners that Jake and I are working on a Reframing the Narrative channel where we will be posting all of our future episodes going forward. This one we'll have on both of our individual ones, but we will be providing all the information about where to find our future episodes, and we'll be migrating everything that direction. Now, Jake and I will be working on our own individual content on our channels, and there's a lot more coming from us, both from a video and a Substack perspective, but definitely look for the new channel, and we'll provide all that information after this broadcast and going forward. So more to look forward to. Really want to thank TJ for contributing the last few weeks. These have been great conversations, and we've been reaching out to some other voices as well to just get some other perspectives and to really kind of build on Jake's comments about audience participation. Not only do we want to see your comments, but if you'd love to be part of this conversation, reach out to us, because we're all on the same team, as we talked about earlier, and doing this together and learning together. So definitely reach out if you'd like to be on one of these broadcasts. We'd love to have you.
In terms of having TJ back, I wanted to quote Michael Jackson and say, "We want you back." So stay tuned, and we'll look forward to our next conversation.
For sure.
Right on.
All right, everyone. Join us next week for episode 5. More to come on that. Until then, stay out of fear.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.